In the fourth unit of this module, we are going to discuss a couple of Dutch studies into the effects of providing cognitive and metacognitive tools in the learning environment, effects on both the process of learning and the learning outcomes. There are a couple of questions which are central here. First of all, some examples of the use of ICT in education, and then more specifically the use of cognitive and metacognitive tools. And after these examples, two examples, basically we are focusing on two questions. One, whether or not students make use of the tools to improve learning or self-regulation. And the second one, what the effect is of, let's say, changing the authenticity of the environment. But we will go into that in a few moments. First, some examples. Two examples, basically. In one example, the first one is the emphasis on cognitive tools, and in the second one on metacognitive tools. The first example is, in fact, a study in which I was involved myself as a supervisor. It was the PhD project of Pascal Wilhelm, one of my PhD students. A very enjoyable project, I must say. Hendrik van Rijn was also involved. He was also a PhD student, recently became professor in Groningen, and he's more in the ICT part of it, so he contributed to the design of the learning environment. The learning environment, which is actually an environment in which students, university students, but also primary school pupils aged 11 and 12 years, in this environment they can do experiments. They can check, let's say, the validity of an hypothesis which relates the values of 5 independent variables to the value of an outcome variable. You see the 5 independent variables in the left gray column with the icons there. You see 5 rows, basically. The first one, it's all has to do with growing plants in this particular example. The first one, you can choose between one time giving water each day or 2 times. The second one, providing herbicides. The third one is let's say, removing leaves or leaving them on the pot. The fourth one is placing the plant at various places in a house, on the balcony or close to the window or more inside the house. And the last one is whether you put the plant in a small pot or in a large pot, basically. So all these variations influence the growing of the plant, and the growing of the plant is the outcome variable. And what students do is they actually choose values on each of the 5 independent variables and predict the outcome, so predict the size of the plant after having, let's say, put into place all of the values of the 5 independent variables on a row. As you can see here, the first row is an experiment in which a plant is given water 1 time a day, no herbicides, no removing of the leaves, let's say close to the window placed, and in I think a small pot, and the participant predicts that the outcome variable, the growth of the plant, will be something like 10 centimeters or whatever. And the outcome, in effect, after having installed everything, then the program says, the simulation environment says it's 20 centimeters. So there's a difference, and then the student can start a new experiment. So this time the student changes herbicides and removing of the leaves of the plant, and see what happens. So he thinks that will improve the growth of the plant, predicting 25 centimeters, and the outcome is again 20 centimeters. So gradually the student, by manipulating the values of the independent variables, tries to find out what the effect is on the outcome variable. That is the environment. And what we were interested in both was the process and the understanding, so the product. That's what we call the comprehension score. So we compared in this study sixth grade children, so 10 years old, in fact, with university students. And what you see is that the sixth grade children were less, let's say, successful in comprehending, in relating the independent variables to the outcome variables, and also less successful in making valid inferences. So both on both effect measures, the university students outperformed the children, which is not that much of a surprise, perhaps. What you see here is that we also asked the participants what they were planning to do, and we also asked them to check the effects of manipulating variables. And so these thinking aloud protocols were collected and analyzed, so we could, in fact, identify the number of plans the participants made, and also the extent to which they checked, in fact, the effects of manipulating variables. And here again you see the difference between university students and sixth grade students. But interestingly, I must say, is that the sixth graders actually made quite well a considerable amount of plans. So they more or less were half successful compared with the university students. Okay, this is a sort of environment in which you can easily study at the cognitive level how people reason, how people actually reason logically in a sort of, experimental environment in which they can manipulate input variables and can study the effect on the output variables. You can include all kinds of models in this environment, with input variables really influencing the outcome variables or not influencing the outcome variables. But you can also include interactions between input variables, which make it, of course, a bit more difficult, a bit harder to identify what the relationship is between the independent and the outcome variables. Okay, that's the example. What we saw is that there is a substantial growth when you compare the sixth graders with the university students in translating data into valid statements about causality, so checking effects of variables, as I mentioned it, in dealing with interactions, you can imagine, and in planning. We also saw that in the data. Okay, let's continue with the second example. This is an example of a couple of studies basically done at Twente University by Ton de Jong as the principal investigator, Adler Zonder and Manlov. And in this study, a particular simulation environment has been developed, CoLab. And this CoLab is in fact an environment in which you can study the all kinds of let's say, natural science, physics problems, or in this case, fluid dynamics problems. The environment has been equipped with what was called a process coordinator, which is basically a metacognitive or self-regulation support tool. It consisted, in fact, of three tools: the planning tool with a goal tree. As you can see in the left top left panel, I don't know whether I can focus. Yes, I can focus into that, where you can see that there is a sort of goal tree with all kinds of important steps to take in order to carry out a simulation experiment. Find out what is the floor about, this floor is about, find out what is in the rooms. It's about the particular environment in which the fluid dynamics problems has to be studied. Assure that you all have the same in mind, identify variables, identify relations, and then modeling and hypothesizing, collecting data, drawing conclusions, and ending up. Okay, there is in the right panel you see a more advanced, perhaps, planning tool in which all steps of doing an experimental study, in fact, are made visible. Modeling and hypothesizing, data collection and drawing conclusions, and then finishing. And then you can zoom into each of these boxes, and then further goals will be, let's say, explained to you. So that was one of the tools, the planning tool. Then there was a monitoring tool, in fact, a notepad in which you could easily draw up all kinds of expressions or hypotheses in order to further study. Hints were also provided. And then there was also an evaluation tool, which was basically a template in order to write lab reports and collect and order your data and your conclusions. Now, when you have a look at the data in which, in fact, the regulative activities were compared between both groups, two groups, the PC Plus group, who did work with the process coordinator, and the PC Minus group, which did not work with the coordinator. And you can see that there were only, as far as planning is concerned, there were, let's say, significant differences between the two groups. So planning actually benefited from providing such a planning tool. Monitoring, so the notepad, and evaluation, the lab reports, were not influenced by the availability of a tool to help you to accomplish that particular part of your self-regulation activities. Okay, again, an example. So an interesting, let's say, series of studies done with this collab environment. Then we move into a study which was actually conducted at the Open University by Rob Martens and his colleagues. And in this study, an environment was offered in which, I have to read it here. An environment was offered in which students studied a particular question: why in a transport company many bus drivers fall ill? So there were all kinds of, again, a simulation environment, all kinds of data included in this environment, which allowed the users, the participants, to draw conclusions about the relationship between the characteristics of the transport company and this particular outcome variable, the number of bus drivers falling ill. There were three, let's say, variations, three versions of the environment which varied in degree of authenticity. There was an authentic version with full student control. There was a text-only version, so no, fancy things which help you to more or less visualize or understand the environment. And then there was also an authentic version with restricted student control. Now, the interesting outcome of this study was that, in fact, only the text-only version did produce better learning outcomes. So the text-only version, which was a more or less abstract version, was in fact a successful environment to produce learning outcomes, predictions about, or in fact interpretations and inferences about relationship between characteristics of the transport company and the ill rate of the bus drivers. Okay. Students did not perceive authentic learning outcomes as more authentic or motivating, so they actually did not make use of the authenticity characteristics of the learning environment. And they also did not consider these characteristics as motivating. So you might say that students prefer to work in a more abstract environment. That's one interpretation. The other is that, well, the authenticity characteristics were not very convincing, perhaps for the users. That's also a possibility. Okay, so then we move to the third example, which has to do with the amount of support. It's a study by Lisbeth Kester and Paul Kirschner in a distance course on educational design. A hypertext was offered to 41 adult students. A hypertext is something like a Wikipedia text, in which you have the text in front of you and you have the possibility to click on various words to further focus or zoom into let's say, particular parts of the reasoning or the paragraph sections which you consider as interesting or relevant for your questions, etc. So it's a matter of a possibility of zooming in on the text. The problem in those texts is particularly when the number of hypertext links are, let's say, quite considerable. You have to have a sort of overview. You need a map, so to speak, in order to understand where you are basically studying the text. And such a map, a concept map, is an important source of conceptual support. This concept map was provided, or there was a flowchart was provided, and an advice on the next step to be taken. So that was more a support tool which helped the process of studying this particular hypertext. Now, the interesting thing was that navigation accuracy, which relates to whether you actually study the text in its complexity, but also completely, and whether you zoom in appropriately on issues which are very important. Well, this navigation accuracy increased under the condition of fading support. So the support had to be faded in order to transfer the responsibility of carrying out this complex educational task by the participants. When they in fact had to make their own decision in the course of the project, then they were more successful than they continually received this kind of support. Task performance did not improve, and the overall conclusion of the authors was that the students did not invest enough time and effort to complete the assignment. So that's always a problem, of course, that students just finish too early and don't give themselves enough time to understand the text which has been provided. And of course, in such a situation, such environment, under such conditions, the effectiveness of all kinds of support does also decrease because students simply do not make use of it. Okay, so these were the conclusions of the study by Lisbeth Kister and Paul Kirchner. And again, an example of providing support, cognitive support and strategic support in an learning environment in which students have to find their way. Okay? So I think now we have discussed a couple of examples which give you an idea of the kind of research which is being done in this area, the domain of metacognition and self-regulation. And this ends the third unit.